welcome back to another Tutorial Tuesday. Today we're going to be taking a look at the basics of brake bias. We'll explain what brake bias is, what it does, and how you can change it to optimize your sim racing. We're also going to analyze the effects of different brake bias settings with the Track Titan platform, where you can analyze your own driving for free and get a couple of extra insights if you sign up using code BrakeBias. Now let's talk about what brake bias is exactly. You might be aware that the race car has front and rear wheels, and both sets of wheels have brakes. When you push the brake pedal, that braking pressure is distributed between the front and the rear brakes. To put it simply, brake bias tells us what percentage of braking is done by the front and the rear wheels. So a brake bias of 50 would mean that the rear and the front wheels are braking equally hard. But shift this up to 60, then the front is doing 60% of the braking, whilst the rear is only doing 40% of the braking. Beware that these percentages don't mean all that much on their own, because each car has their own baseline brake balance that works well for that car and its weight distribution. When it comes to changing the brake bias, you should really be focused more on shifting it to the front or the back, depending on your driving style and what you want to get out of the car. So let's figure out how we can actually set the brake bias right for our own car and our own driving style. The first thing you need to know is what the actual effects are of changing the brake bias. When we shift the brake bias to the front, the car will have more braking force and it'll be more stable under braking. This also means that when you shift the brake bias too much to the front, you will experience understeer and locking up front wheels. When we shift the brake bias more to the rear, the car will have less braking force and it can turn more easily under braking, which helps with trail braking. But this also means that it's more likely to oversteer when you shift the brake balance too much to the back. Especially in ACC, standard setups have the brake bias set to something that works pretty well, but it's not tailored to your driving style. So if you're just getting into changing the setups, try tinkering with the brake bias in the following way. If you feel like your car isn't stable enough during the braking zones, shift the brake bias forward 1% or 2. Or if you feel like your car is not rotating enough through the corners with the agility you'd like it to have, shift the brake bias to the rear a little bit. Remember that setup changes are always a solution to a problem, so be sure you know what you're trying to solve. Now, to show the impact of a change in brake bias, we've driven 2 laps at Monza with the BMW M4. The lap in orange had the default aggressive setup brake bias of 60.2%, whilst the lap in blue had its brake bias set to a whopping 65%, so a lot more forward bias. Now, you would think this forward brake bias would help us in the long and heavy braking zones Monza is known for, but as it turns out, 65% forward brake bias is a little bit too much. In the first corner, we can already see the impact of this setup change when we look at the braking points. On the blue lap with more forward brake bias, we actually have to brake a little bit earlier. Now, this is a bit counterintuitive, as you would expect the braking zones to be shorter with a more front heavy brake bias. Setting the brake bias to 65 made the front wheels more prone to locking up. Luckily, we also have ABS in our GT3 BMW, which reduces the brake pressure to prevent tire lockups. But by having to rely so heavily on ABS to prevent the lockups, the braking zone was actually lengthened. So by setting the brake bias too far forward, it was actually detrimental to our braking ability. Because the brake bias in the orange lap is set more to the rear, we can beautifully see that they can more easily trail brake into this corner, while the blue lap has to stay on the brakes for longer to actually slow down as much. So this showcases how setting the brake bias right for the situation can help a ton with gaining lap time. Let's talk about how we can actually make brake bias work in our favor. If you're feeling like your car is not quite moving with enough agility through the corners after a braking zone, shift the brake bias 1% or 2 to the back. Or if you feel like you're overshooting corners regularly, or the car becomes mighty unstable during heavy braking zones, shift the brake bias a couple percent to the front. If you're changing the brake bias on the setup screen, you're setting your brake bias for the start of the race. but brake bias is actually something you can change on the fly during a race if you bind some buttons on your wheel to change it. This is a little bit of an advanced technique which you should definitely practice before trying out during an online race, but just in case you want to try it out, you can shift your brake bias to the front when a heavy braking zone is coming up for more front stability, and you can shift your brake bias a little bit to the rear on other corners when you want the car to be a little bit more agile. If you're not quite ready to change your brake bias during a race but want to experiment with it on the setup screen, try shifting the brake bias a little bit forward on tracks with heavier braking zones like Monza, and try shifting your brake bias somewhat more to the rear on tracks that require more agility under braking like Laguna Seca. Now we hope you've learned something about brake bias today. Let us know if we've missed anything. Check out Track Titan in the description down below, and we hope to see you in the next one.